what is up, y'all? Happy weekend. Hopefully you're having a good day out there. And if you're not having a good day, I hope that it gets better soon. Maybe this is just a perception I'm having. But you know how the older generations have started noticing more and more diagnoses of mental illnesses, mental disorders, autism, ADHD, things like that? And at least what I'm hearing, what my parents have always said, all this stuff, like they always go, oh, this newer generation is so soft and that's why they can't handle it anymore. And, they claim to have anxiety and depression and things are just too hard for them. And they always use the silent generation and the boomer generation as proof of how real men used to be and how strong everyone used to be. And they were so resilient and tough, yada, yada, yada. On a similar note, I hear a lot of complaints about how autism and mental illnesses are seen as trendy because they didn't exist back in the old days, and maybe it's caused by vaccines, maybe it's caused by too much TV, maybe it's just because we're all weak snowflakes. But bottom line, the common complaint is that diagnoses are running rampant and it just didn't exist back in our day, right? And I want to talk about that in this episode, because there's a lot to unpack there, but let's get into it. We are going to go the Disney route today, okay? We're going to dive into the mental illnesses of some of our favorite characters. Maybe you noticed it, maybe you didn't. And as always, I feel like mental health is often treated like a swear word, a taboo subject that you're not allowed to talk about because it inherently means you're broken or damaged somehow or just simply weak, like this was your choice. Like if you were just stronger, you could have handled it and managed it on your own. Like anxiety and depression and ADHD are just you failing to be organized enough or positive enough. I think that people always struggled with these mental illnesses. They just weren't recognized, acknowledged, talked about, and definitely not treated. And as we all know, just because you don't acknowledge it or you refuse to say it out loud doesn't mean it doesn't actually exist. And one thing I do want to say before I really dive into the content for this episode, when people say that the silent generation, those kids fighting in World War II and the Vietnam War, how they were so strong, how they were so resilient, how they were able to, deal with all of these atrocities and be, and then pull themselves up by their bootstraps and, be strong, hardworking, real men, And I just hope that we are all on the same page with recognizing that that is not how it was. First off, these were children, like teens, 17, 16, 18, 19-year-old kids, children thrown into war scenarios. And they were not okay. And I think by reinforcing this idea that they were so tough, so resilient, nothing shook them, they were just stoic and brave and yada yada, I think it actually diminishes their experiences and diminishes the strength that it did take for them to go through those things, because they were absolutely wrecked. They watched their friends die in front of them. They watched people be blown up in front of them. They watched themselves get mutilated and get limbs blown off and lose eyes and all sorts of other war atrocities. They were not okay, right? PTSD wasn't acknowledged yet, obviously it existed, but not in the same capacity that it does now. So they kind of deemed it shell shock, but also it was absolutely looked down upon. Like that was not something that you admit you have. That is not something that you were proud to have. And obviously there was zero treatment. And so these people weren't okay. They weren't so strong and resilient. They were broken. They were broken people. And they came home, they were not treated well, they were not taken care of, they did not get treatment, they did not get help. They did not have support. They came home and then they didn't know how to cope, didn't have any support system. And so then they took out all of that trauma on their children, on their wives, on their partners, on everybody, right? And so, yeah, if the roast beef was a little dry, the wife got a little love tap upside the head. And that was fine because partner abuse didn't actually exist in a court of law yet. Their kids got beat to kingdom come if they literally said anything. They were supposed to be just quiet and sit there all the time unless they were spoken to. And so, they were not okay, point blank. And so I hope we all know that, right? And I hope we're all on the same page that mental illness did exist then. They just didn't have the privilege of acknowledging it and getting treatment. But let's focus on these Disney characters, okay? We're going to start off nice and mellow and easy. We all know Rapunzel, right? From Tangled. She had textbook Stockholm Syndrome. Okay, she always had love and empathy for Mother Gothel. So much guilt when she finally left the tower and she's like, oh, it's going to break her heart. And how could I do that? I'm such a bad daughter. Back and forth for like the entire song, right? Of going back and forth on if she should leave or should she not and how could she. Despite the constant emotional and verbal abuse and abduction, the whole hostage situation of Mother Gothel, let's not forget that, right? That whole situation, damn near every single song is still littered with examples of neurotic and narcissistic abuse. Mother Gothel is classic narcissist who manipulates Rapunzel at every step of the way. And I know when we normally talk about Stockholm Syndrome, usually the first one that probably pops into your mind is Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She usually gets brought up a lot. But that one's actually kind of contested because she wasn't like chained up she wasn't necessarily physically constrained. I know she sort of volunteered herself as a captive, but she was given a bedroom and then basically free range chicken access to the whole house, minus the West Wing. Plus, I think the big thing there is Beast did not always play the captor role. His behavior changed pretty drastically, pretty quickly, and he did technically let her leave pretty soon after she became a quote-unquote captive. And so it's kind of a morally gray area, right? Like, I don't know that I would place Belle in a Stockholm Syndrome situation, but Rapunzel, absolutely Stockholm. Now, we talked about Mother Gothel being a narcissist. Another narcissist that I feel like often gets overlooked is Scar from The Lion King. And I know many of us recognize that Lion King is an absolute complete Disney ripoff of Hamlet. But I feel like a lot of times when we are talking about mental disorders in media, and especially cartoons and Disney characters, because this is a pretty common, you go on any Reddit page, like it's a pretty common trend. I think he was Swedish maybe, some scientist in 2000 basically put out the theory about Winnie the Pooh that we'll talk about later. And ever since then, I feel like it's just kind of been running rampant on, different fan fiction type theories of mental disorders and mental illnesses in some of these cartoons. But Scar from The Lion King, he never gets brought up as a narcissist, which I think is interesting. My personal theory is because a lot of times we don't include him in the sociopathy, narcissistic personality disorder conversation because he's a guy. I think we are quick to identify manipulation techniques in women, but not so much the men, which I think is really interesting. I don't know. That's just my theory. Now, I am going to try to stay focused on this next one, but Peter Pan, good Lord. Let's unpack that one. First off, Captain Hook definitely has PTSD. He loses his hand in a very traumatic experience, I will say, constantly shows the telltale signs of aggression and fear that come with PTSD. Honestly, I think that Hook is actually the anti-hero and was only trying to stop Peter Pan from abducting children to do who knows what with them on Neverland. Because if you think about it, really think about it, Hook never went after the kids. He only ever chased Peter Pan. He never actually hurt any kids. He threatened Tiger Lily and Wendy to walk the plank, once? But that was only as bait, I think, to get to Peter Pan, to kind of like egg him out. And let's be real, Peter Pan was probably trafficking out those kids and then killing them off once they hit puberty. Because he probably made a deal with some fairies, fed Hook's hand to the crocodile, and then he got immortality, and then he's been stealing and abducting all these children right before they hit puberty. So they're pure and innocent and yada yada. And then once they hit puberty, or if they disagree with him and try and challenge Peter Pan, try and leave Neverland, then he kills them off. And then goes finds more kids to replace them. I don't know. That's just my theory. I heard a quote somewhere, of course I can't remember where now, but they were saying every villain is just a victim who hasn't been understood yet. And that's how I feel about Hook. I feel like there is a whole backstory to Hook. Yes, I've seen the Hook movie, but I think there's a whole backstory to him that we as a collective society should be listening to more, because I don't think he's really the villain. And furthermore, Peter Pan has his own pop psychology diagnosis title thing. It's called the Peter Pan syndrome, where people have this social and emotional immaturity and they just aggressively resist the transition to adulthood. Obviously, it isn't a legitimate medical diagnosis, but it's so common that it's a wildly used pop psychology reference, which is a little concerning, but a lot of articles that I read said that it's like a stem of some form of childhood neglect, childhood abuse, or trauma, and that's why they're kind of regressing back into childhood and refuse to take on the responsibilities and the terrifying aspect of adulthood. But I still think Peter Pan's kind of the villain. I don't know. I can't get behind him. Moving on, we have Elsa from Frozen. This one's really, it's a bit more complicated, right? She does show signs of paranoia and agoraphobia, which is where, you're scared to be in open places, scared of public places, but also classic anxiety and depression. I mean, the isolation, the sadness, the inability to emotionally regulate herself, it's all there. And Pinocchio, no surprise, compulsive pathological liar. And this is what's interesting. I didn't know this. The original story was written around 1880. So there's actually a term in the healthcare realm, same thing, like more legitimate than the pop psychology reference of Peter Pan syndrome, but almost a legitimate medical diagnosis called the Pinocchio syndrome. And that's, obviously, as you can gather, for people who compulsively lie, even when there's no reason to. And they it's compulsive, so they can't help themselves. It's not like they want to lie, and they don't necessarily know why they lie. They just feel this overwhelming urge and this compulsion to lie, which is kind of interesting, I think. Next, we have Ariel. Personally, I've never loved The Little Mermaid. I just feel like it's encouraging misogyny, and she just has no personality. She sacrifices herself and her lifestyle and her home and her voice for a man. She's pretty dumb. Like, she's not smart at all. She doesn't read contracts before she signs them. The music isn't even that good. And so I could go on and on, but she also has some signs of mental illnesses. She actually shows signs of OCD, specifically with her hoarding tendencies, which fall under the category of OCD as a common symptom of it. And the official term is dysposophobia, but it's that compulsive urge to hoard things. And especially when you have emotional attachment to items that are not necessarily sentimental. So for example, for her, she has like jars of toenails and weird clippings and hair clippings and stuff. And then also another important aspect of hoarding versus just saving a lot of things and collecting things is when you have collections, you are inherently proud of them. You put them on display, there's this unconscious desire for people to kind of see them. But with hoarding, there's this unconscious, subconscious level of guilt and shame around that hoarding. And so you don't necessarily want people to see it. And so a lot of times hoarders tend to kind of isolate, and they'll almost kind of hide their hoarding things, their collections, if you will. They kind of stash them somewhere where it's sort of out of sight. They don't introduce it to other people, and that's kind of one of those key distinguishing features of hoarding versus collecting. And we see that in this storyline with Ariel. So, because her stuff is kind of buried all over, and she doesn't really seem like she's super stoked to show it off to people. Now, let's go over to, we've stayed pretty mellow so far on the Disney characters and their diagnoses, right? Let's get over to the freaky deaky side. Let's add a little MDMA into the mix. And we have Alice from Alice in Wonderland. Textbook definition, classic example of paranoid schizophrenia. Her adventures down the rabbit hole are all hallucinations, which the Diagnostic Statistical Manual 5, DSM-5, that's like the Bible for all psychology diagnoses. DSM-5 definition of hallucinations is, quote, seeing, hearing, or feeling things that only exist to you, unquote, along with her delusions, which are, quote, beliefs that are misinterpreted from realness, unquote. So hallucinations and delusions are technically different things. She obviously, entirely loses her grip on reality as the story progresses. But the whole body size changing, being too big for the door, too small to get on the table, all these things, that's also actually a sign of schizophrenia, because one of the characteristics of schizophrenics is visual perception issues. And another sign, her extreme paranoia that manifests as a fear of being harmed by the Queen of Hearts is also a telltale sign, because it's one of the most common symptoms of schizophrenia, which I thought was super interesting. And now we are getting into it, the bread and butter for this episode, Winnie the Pooh. Okay, my favorite, the one that spurred on this whole episode actually. The original Winnie the Pooh book, like the whole book, not just the little mini stories, but the whole book was actually on my top 100 books scratch off poster that I've been working through. So I read it a few months ago, and I mean, I loved it. It's Winnie the Pooh. You can't hate it, It's our childhood. But I especially love it looking back on it now from this, I would say from a psychological standpoint. Obviously, I know I don't have a degree or a background in psychology, but I've taken my fair share of abnormal psych classes and behavioral psych classes and all those things, right? And I think it's fascinating, and especially in this mental health discussion, because I think it's the most accurate portrayal of society and the wide range of characters that we interact with every single day. I think it's the most relatable and the most diverse cast that actually reflects our community. And it was originally published in 1926. So this was during that time of, the strong, independent, the resilient generation that we always brag about, and how, they didn't have these disorders and they weren't so weak and blah, blah, blah. But were they? Were they? That's what we're going to talk about. Because just about every single character in that entire book, almost every single one has a clear-cut mental illness, at least one. A lot of them, honestly, have like multiple mental illnesses or mental disorders or personality disorders. They have multiple that they're like, ooh, it could be this one, it could be that one. They also show signs of this. And so it's fascinating. But I think what I love so much about this is that this not only showcases that these disorders and struggles were absolutely present in previous generations, but it also shows us that we are not unlovable because of these mental disorders and mental illnesses. And this was back in 1926 with the strongest generation around, according to them. And so it's not just like a modern DEI woke shenanigans, right? Like it was just reality back then. It was just the average social circle at that time. It was just a boy and his friends. And I think there's something so beautiful about that, especially considering the book was written before the terminology learning disorder and before, honestly, half of these disorders were even established and had definitions written about them yet. And so I think that really tells you this isn't just an author that's saying, hey, I want to have a diverse cast, so let me plant this disorder and that disorder and this illness and that illness. No, he was just literally writing what he knew. And that collection of his community and that collection of all those different identities, that was just what we saw. And I love that. I love it. So let's get into it. Let's start with the big man himself, Winnie the Pooh. Pooh represents an eating disorder, first and foremost. But some theories also include ADHD, and the eating disorder is a symptom of that, with that impulsivity and or OCD. And, maybe that's the stem of his compulsive eating habits. But at its core, binge eating disorder, it's repeated binge eatings that occur at least once a week for at least 3 months. The binge eating episodes must include several features such as eating fast, eating if not hungry, eating past feeling full, and or feeling bad about eating so much. And I think we can all agree that he absolutely had those symptoms. Piglet, my favorite. I wonder why. He represents an anxiety, just straight up blanket generalized anxiety disorder. And that is excessive, uncontrollable, and long-lasting worry about minor things. The DSM-5 criteria for generalized anxiety disorder is excessive anxiety and worry at least 50% of days about multiple domains of event or activities such as family, health, finances, work, school, yada, yada, yada. The person will find it hard to control the worry and the anxiety, and worry is associated with at least 3 symptoms or 1 symptom in children, including restlessness of feeling keyed up, on edge, tiring easily, difficulty concentrating, mind going blank, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance. The list goes on and on. I also saw some theories, because like I said, this is actually well documented. This concept of mental disorders, neurodivergent behavior in specifically the Winnie the Pooh series has been well studied and documented in a variety of sources, peer-reviewed journals, since, like I said, 2000, when that one scientist first initiated this theory. But a lot of theories I saw said that Piglet's stutter and his ear twitch are also symptoms of his anxiety disorder, and that his stutter actually developed from some injury or more than likely something traumatic that happened to him early on in his life that crippled his self-esteem, and then that's what led to that overly anxious behavior. Poor Piglet. Tigger, as I'm sure we can all guess, ADHD. Characterized by hyperactive behaviors that are extreme for a particular developmental period, persistent across different impairment situations, linking to significant impairments in functioning. There may be difficulty controlling their activity in situations that call for sitting still, such as classroom, work environment. They may also experience difficulty getting along with peers, caused by aggressive and intrusive behaviors, difficulty noticing subtle social cues, being singled out very quickly and rejected or neglected by peers, yada yada. Kanga shows signs of social anxiety disorder, and I would also go out on a limb to say postpartum anxiety specifically. She's very overprotective of her son, never lets him make his own decisions, always has to keep him in her pouch, so on and so forth. And then her son, Rue, shows signs of autism. And this one is not talked about as much, but I did see his name and his diagnosis popping up in a few of the more recent theories on this and some of the more recent articles and studies. And so his signs of autism were that he lacks the situational awareness, especially when it comes to dangerous situations. He's just completely oblivious to it. And oftentimes he just sits in his mother's pouch, completely ignoring the world around him. He just kind of blocks everything out. So I mean, it tracks, right? It tracks. Eeyore, no surprise here, major depressive disorder. A sad mood or loss of interest in pleasure with at least 5 symptoms present. Symptoms include sleeping too much or too little, psychomotor agitation, poor appetite and weight loss, or increased appetite and weight gain, loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, difficulty concentrating, thinking, or making decisions, reoccurrent thoughts of death or suicide. These symptoms are present nearly every day, most of the day, for at least 2 weeks, and are distinct from and more severe than a normative response to significant loss, so on and so forth. We all kind of know the signs and symptoms, I would hope, at this point. Now, rabbit represents obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Obsessions are intrusive and persistent thoughts, images, or impulses that are uncontrollable and are often experienced as irrational. Compulsions are repetitive, clearly excessive behaviors or mental acts to reduce anxiety and are extremely difficult to resist the impulses that may involve elaborate behavioral rituals. The DSM-5 criteria defined obsessions by recurrent, intrusive, persistent, unwanted thoughts, urges, or images in which the person has tried to ignore, suppress, or neutralize the thoughts, urges, or images. Now, owl is another tricky one that has several diagnoses attached to him depending on what study you read. And while you may be thinking, okay, well, if we can't pinpoint it, then it obviously must not be legit, I think it's more of the fact that it really highlights this concept of comorbidity, which means that a lot of these diagnoses and a lot of these illnesses go hand in hand. So if you have one, a lot of times you have the other, or, illness A impacts and leads into illness B, and they kind of feed off of each other, if you will. And I think it kind of strengthens the argument that these mental illnesses, and this is something that so many people struggle with, and it's so common that an author of a children's book put it into his character of an owl without even realizing what he was doing, because it's just so deeply ingrained in people's identities, and it's so common that it didn't even raise a red flag for him, right? So owl represents narcissistic personality disorder and dyslexia, which, is a reading disorder, but also short-term memory loss. And now, narcissistic personality disorders, we've talked about Mother Gothel, we talked about Scar, right? It's a grandiose view of self with preoccupied fantasies of great success. Self-centered is the demand, constant attention, lack of empathy, or feelings of arrogance, envy, entitlement, a view of themselves as superior to others. And the primary goal of interaction with others is to bolster their own self-esteem. And if you listened to this bird try to read anything and then correct the other animals who actually said it correctly, so infuriating. I don't know why I get so tilted and triggered by owl, but I was like, I just want to punch this little owl in its face. I don't know why it tilts me to no end. Anyway, moving on. We have the OG, perhaps arguably the creator of this whole, MDMA fest in the 100-Acre Wood. We have Christopher Robin, who also represents, just like Alice, schizophrenia. And so we've already talked about some schizophrenia signs, right? I'm not going to repeat it. A little bit less MDMA on this storyline, a little bit less of the hallucinations, but also if you really take a step back, they're just not quite as colorful and dramatic and exuberant and over the top as Alice's. But considering, Pooh is a stuffed bear, right? The other animals may or may not exist. Because, is it believable to have a rabbit in the woods? Sure. An owl in the woods? Sure. A tiger? A kangaroo existing in the forest? Presumably somewhere in the north? Much less likely, right? And so it's theorized that the entirety of all of these personalities are actually just manifestations of Christopher Robin's manic episodes based on his mood. Which, what he's doing as a young boy, wandering out into 100 acres of woods. 100 acres is a pretty good chunk of land, right? What he's doing on his own, spending that many hours in the woods, a little questionable, I personally, my thoughts go to, I'm like, okay, what's happening in your home that you are so unwilling to be in your home? Where are your parental figures that you never talk about ever, you never acknowledge? Where is anybody to watch you, first off? Like, where's your supervision? I grew up in the woods, right? And so, like, hear me well on that. I am all for playing in the woods. I'm all for free-range chicken parenting. But also, where were the parents? And more importantly, what was happening in the home that he didn't feel safe having that as a sanctuary? What was happening in his life, in his childhood, that he had to regress and remove himself so dramatically from reality that he had to create his own reality, create his own support system, create his own, if you will, family and friend group of manifestations of delusions and hallucinations? That's kind of sad to me. That makes me think like, okay, whoa, something was going on. Something very dramatic and traumatic was happening in your childhood that you had to then escape from. And that's always going to break my heart, But, I know I'm always recommending books to y'all, and more often than not, y'all are probably like, yeah, sure, okay, that will never happen. But I know it sounds funky, but honestly, like, if you guys ever get a free, few days or something to read, I would check out the Winnie the Pooh book, the first one, the original, the OG. The audiobook was maybe 2.5, maybe 3 hours. It's very, very quick. And yeah, it's stories of Winnie the Pooh, but honestly, when you read it from this perspective and you're thinking in that psychological aspect, it's pretty interesting. I don't know. I enjoyed it, honestly. I thought it was a fun read. And I just think, like I said, I think it's fascinating that this author can reflect so much of society and the different, the myriad of personalities that you see out there. I think that's just so cool, especially at 1926, considering the times, to have such a diverse list of characters, because quite honestly, you don't see that today. Like, very rarely do you see stories with characters that have easily diagnosable mental disorders. And especially if you do see them where they're not, stigmatized and stereotyped, and they're not the villain. They're not this, chaotic, unhinged Harley Quinn Joker type situation. It's just Tigger. It's just Rabbit. It's just Kanga, and that's just them. And they're just like, the amount of love that Eeyore gets just warms my heart, because he never encourages them. He never does anything positive. He's always so sad. But you know what? He gets invited every single time. And they always give him a Christmas gift. And they always say, that's okay, Eeyore, you can come hang out with us. They don't pressure him to be anything else. They don't pressure him to smile, to laugh more, to lighten up. They just accept him for who he is. And I just think that's the best thing ever. And yeah. What can I say? Mass media reflects society. Art reflects reality. What was happening in Winnie the Pooh was happening in real life in 1926. And hopefully that's encouraging to you guys. It's encouraging to me, because that tells me that this was always around. We just didn't have words for it yet. We just didn't have treatment for it yet. We just didn't have, a plan for it yet. We didn't know how to treat it, how to diagnose it, or how to deal with it. But now we do. And now we can take steps in the right direction. And so I just think it's encouraging to know that, this has always been around. And even when you're watching a children's movie, maybe you can find a character that you relate to. And then you can see something and be like, you know what? Eeyore was still loved. People will still love me too, even if I'm in a funk right now. Even if I don't feel like smiling and laughing right now. They still loved Eeyore. They still accepted Eeyore. They'll still accept me too. I just think it's beautiful. So with that, hopefully this episode has encouraged you a little bit, cheered you up a little bit. I know it's kind of some dark, dark times out there, right? Like, we're in the middle of a hostile government takeover, or however that song goes. That's super catchy. And I just think we need a little bit more positivity in our lives. So Hopefully you have a good day. Hopefully this lightens your day a little bit. I look forward to hearing from you all soon. If you have anything that you need from me, any episode ideas, you know you can always send them my way. I'm always eager to hear what y'all have to say. With that being said, make good choices. Be a decent human being. Take care of each other. Don't be scared or intimidated by mental illness or mental disorders. If you are struggling with something, you are not alone. Read Winnie the Pooh. If you are not struggling with something and you're not familiar with some of these disorders or these illnesses, don't be scared of them. If someone comes up to you and they're vulnerable enough with you and they say, yeah, I have this. This is something I live with. Accept them. Ask questions. Be curious. Be understanding. And accept them for who they are. And maybe read Winnie the Pooh so you're a little bit more familiar and comfortable with the diagnoses as well. And you can see different ways that it presents. And with that being said, I will catch y'all next time. Okay, bye!